Welcome to Madlik. My name is Geoffrey Stern, and at Madlik, we light a spark or shed some light on a Jewish text or tradition. Along with Rabbi Adam Mintz, I host Madlik Disruptive Torah on Clubhouse every Thursday at 8 p.m. Eastern and share it as the Madlik podcast on your favorite platform. Today we explore how a skin condition became identified with slander in rabbinic texts. So rinse your mouth and wash your face and join us for Loose Lips and Leprosy. So welcome, Rabbi, another week of Madlik Disruptive Torah. And I was all prepared to say to you, maybe the reason why leprosy was compared to speaking evil was because there was a quiet week in the Parshiot and no one had anything to talk about. These, especially in this cycle where we have Tazria and Metzora, two portions that are just very hard to connect to. I mean, they talk about houses that get mold in them and all sorts of stuff that we can hardly relate to. And then as I started doing my research, I said, this is a little bit more than just filling in the white space. The amount of texts that are invested in making the association between this skin condition, which is called leprosy in the English translation, probably isn't quite that, and the evils of speaking evil, slander, are all over the place. The sections that you go to when you do a search don't have an isolated paragraph. They go on and on. So I think we're actually in for a little bit of a treat. It's not something that most people have not heard of. I think it's fairly common knowledge that leprosy and Lashon Hara are identified, but I think we might be a little bit interested and surprised by how deep, profound, and maybe even directions are taken that we weren't expecting. So let's begin with Leviticus 14, 1 through 3. And it says, God spoke to Moses saying, "This shall be the ritual for a leper at the time of being purified. When it has been reported to the priest shall go outside the camp. If the priest sees that the leper has been healed of the scaly affection," and then it goes on to describe different types of this dermatological ailment and different levels of purity. But one thing is pretty clear, that it is done outside of the camp. It is done outside in the open. And somehow it piqued the interest of the moralists who connected it to speaking evil. So let's just stop here. Do you think that a simple drush hermeneutic that the connection was made? Do you think it's inherent in the text? How do you explain it?
Well, first of all, you started by saying that we have 2 weeks of this, which is fascinating, right? We have 2 weeks of these kinds of parashas, which are hard to kind of find relevant. But I think the idea of biblical diseases is a fascinating topic. And what I mean by that is, I think we may have mentioned last week, when you think about, the characters in the Bible, nobody dies of disease. How is that possible, right? Nobody dies of cancer. Nobody has a heart attack. Everybody seems to die of old age. The one exception in the book of Genesis is that Rachel dies in childhood. But that's not exactly sickness. Why doesn't anybody get sick? I think the answer is that in the pre-penicillin era, when they couldn't cure diseases, they had to somehow get their arms around disease. The only way they knew to get their arms around disease was by saying that the disease was a punishment for a sin. So no, it's not inherent in the text, but basically the text has no choice but to suggest that that there's a reason for it, and the reason has to be a sin. Mitzora sounds like motzi shem ra, which is the Hebrew word for gossip. That's really where it's at. It's kind of it's a similarity of words. It's a similarity of hearing, of pronunciation. That's really the connection.
So I love the fact that you make us aware that in the Bible till now, yes, there are people that are killed as a punishment. They're swallowed into the earth, things like that. But in terms of especially the main characters, the pivotal characters, they just die. And, there are beautiful euphemisms for that. They are gathered into their people. And we focused a little bit on that. But you're right. There's no particular disease. And as someone who has just this past week experienced death in a hospital, you got to put something in the death certificate. You can't say this 95-year-old person died of old age. It's got to be something. Conjunctive heart disease, pulmonary failure. And you're absolutely right that although this doesn't necessarily talk about death, but it does make it does focus on a disease, on an ailment. And the rabbis, as you say, in Erechin 15b, Reish Lakish says, this is the law of the leper. This means this shall be the laws of a defamer, Motzi Shemra. So on the one hand, you kind of scratch your head and say, well, if it was that, why didn't you say it? But on the other hand, I think what he's doing is tied into what you talked about. And this is kind of controversial because in a sense, what we're saying is bad things happen to bad people. And that's a very scary concept on the one hand. In terms of morality and edification, it's nice for us to think if we do something bad, we might get punished. Our bodies might misfunction, whether if we abuse them by eating the wrong thing or saying the wrong thing. So it is a slippery slope. But let's talk first about the positive side, that it's trying to take a moral message, a moral meaning from an ailment such as what is called leprosy. And I think what we can certainly do is focus on what directions the text kind of take this for now, and maybe later we'll come back to the other aspect of it, which is, are you really saying that bad things only happen to bad people, and that if someone who seems to be righteous gets a skin ailment, you can assume that he must have been speaking Lashon Hara?
Right. I think that's. I think that really is the question of the parsha. If you had to kind of get the parsha down to one question, that really is the question about how you connect Lashon Hara to this skin ailment. There's another question, by the way. What exactly is the ailment? So in the title you called it leprosy, but you said that it's not really leprosy. Most of the scholars identify it more with psoriasis. In leprosy, it's interesting, leprosy, until very recently, the Western world was scared of leprosy. On Governor's Island, on Roosevelt Island, there's actually a leper hospital. It does not use as a leper hospital anymore, but there's a building that is a leper hospital. A leper hospital means that the people were afraid of lepers. They thought that leprosy was contagious. And therefore, people who got leprosy were literally put in a hospital away on Roosevelt Island, away from everybody. People were afraid of leprosy. Isn't that interesting? I wonder whether that's connected to our parsha.
Well, I do think that leprosy or any type of dermatological skin ailment is distinct from other ailments. You can be walking around with heart disease and no one knows it. You can have any sort of disease, internal organs, no one knows it. I think what's unique about whatever this is, whether it's leprosy or some other variation, is that you can see the disease. You're wearing it on your shirt sleeve, so to speak. And I think that is what possibly guides the rabbis, and some of the commentaries that say not only is it a punishment, but it's a punishment for something that somebody does in private and has implications to the public. And therefore, the punishment is made to fit the crime, midah keneged midah, and you are punished in public for something that you did to hurt somebody in private. And that, I think, is a little bit of a clue as to why the rabbis thought that leprosy had to do with motzi shemra. Motzi means, like in Yetziat Mitzrayim, taking something out into public, and shemra, obviously we know from wisdom literature, from Mishlei, that the most important thing that anybody has is a good name. So that, I think, is, am I correct in saying that the rabbis kind of make that connection here?
They definitely make that connection. And you're right. Shem Ra is the opposite of a Shem Tov. Actually, the Mishnah in Pirkei Avot says that what you need, Shem Tov, Keter Shem Tov, Olal Gabehem. That the most important thing of all is to have a good name. And that's a really important idea.
So I think we've established that one of the connections, besides the play on word, which is probably a little artificial, one of the connections is this public-private space. But the other is in the narrative itself. In Numbers 12, we learn of Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Cushite woman whom he had married. For he had married a Cushite woman. And they had a problem with either her being a Cushite or something to do with their marital relationship. And then it goes on in verse 10, and when the cloud was removed from over the tent, behold, Miriam was leprous, as white as snow. And Aaron looked upon Miriam, and behold, she was leprous. And the commentaries and the Midrash start to do something that we're now going to encounter, which is this is a sin that is full of nuance. This is a sin that scholars up until the great Chafetz Chaim, who wrote a complete book just on the laws of Lashon Hara, were totally aware. How do you distinguish between saying Lashon Hara and listening to it? How do you respond if you hear it? So here in this particular case, the Ibn Ezra and also the Gemara says that Aaron was published too because he listened to it. But in any case, I think here is a clear connection between speaking bad of somebody, speaking bad of somebody's private affairs, marital affairs, maybe even race, and the affliction of this dermatological condition. I think that is absolutely correct. Now, there is an interesting question about why your skin turning white is the appropriate punishment for Lashon Hara. I think that's a good question to ask. And I think probably the answer is that when you speak Lashon Hara, you want to harm other people. And, it's like you're acting as if you're superior to other people. If I gossip about you, I'm feeling superior to you. And, the way to handle someone who feels superior is to embarrass them publicly. And if their skin turns white, they're embarrassed publicly. So that's also an interesting twist on all of this, that actually the punishment, we would say, the punishment fits the crime. Well, I think that normally we think of white as something that's pure. When the thread on Yom Kippur turns from red to white, we know that our prayers have been answered. But what you raise is this issue of embarrassing someone. And in Hebrew, it's malbin panei chaveiro. So those of you who know Hebrew, malbin comes from the word lavan, which is white. And the concept is if you embarrass somebody in public, the blood leaves their face. They turn white. And maybe there's that connection.
Good. I like that also. That's good. Malbin pnei chaveiro. So you embarrass them, they turn white, so your skin turns white too. The other thing that's interesting is what's the punishment for what happens to you if you get this disease? And what happens is that you have to leave the camp. Badad yeshev. Now that's very relevant to us because we have a term for that these days. You call it quarantine, right? You have to leave the camp. You can't be with other people. Now everybody who's had COVID knows how depressing it is to be in COVID quarantine. And here, this is what they did. They put him in quarantine. They had to go outside the camp. They couldn't interact with anybody in the camp. That's also very relevant to the sin that they violated.
So obviously, this concept of you think you hurt somebody with just language, but it has physical consequences. And I think there's that connection as well. Not only is there that momentary loss of face color, so to speak, but you can do unremittable damage. I mean, we all know, unfortunately, from what happens on the internet, where there are companies designed to help you clear your name. The old story that I believe came from the Chafetz Chaim that says that speaking evil is worse than any other sin because it's like a pillow full of goose feathers. Once you open it up, you can't control where those goose feathers go. And if you want to repent, and you're asked to retrieve all of those goose feathers, it's almost impossible. So the idea is you start by speaking speech only, and then you end up by creating hurt that is not easily retrieved or taken back. It leaves an indelible mark.
That is a great image. I mean, that's a famous Chafetz Chaim image. But that idea of you can control, and we all know it. Right? Once something's on the internet, it goes places you never would have imagined. What do they say? Don't put anything in an email that you wouldn't say, to the whole world, that you wouldn't publish in the New York Times, because potentially that's what's going to happen to it. And that's really the image of the Chafetz Chaim long before there was email.
And the Hebrew expression is hachoshed b'ksherim lokeh begufo. Someone who is choshed, who suspects somebody of being evil, and they are kosher, they get hurt bodily. So there's, it's when I started, I forgot all of these nuances, and I said, we all sit around the table on Friday night, and somebody says, did you hear what happened to this one? And we all say, don't say Lashon Hara. Let's not get down there. You see the side of a bus in Israel, and if you Google the word Lashon Hara and you look at the images, it's amazing. People have bumper stickers that say, don't speak Lashon Hara. But Lashon Hara taken by the rabbis and parsed by the rabbis gets into all sorts of things. Like, we have to believe that there's the story of Rav Kook, who would see a car driving on Shabbat, and instead of throwing a stone, he would say Mazel Tov, because in his mind, why else would you be driving a car on Shabbat if you weren't going to the hospital with a baby? So that's Dan Lekav Zchut. That's when you think that whatever anybody does, there must be some righteousness in it. It's the opposite of Choshed B'Ksherim. We've come across this concept of listening. Aaron, according to the Midrash, was also punished with leprosy. It came and it went faster, but he just created an audience for it. So there's that aspect of it. But the one fascinating point is that all of the commentators, as they begin to speak, say, although this is not a commandment. And of course, there is a commandment that says that you shall not lo telech rachil b'amecha. You should not go about and speak Rechilut, is certainly a synonym to Lashon Hara, but because of the context that it's in, and it talks about judging and showing favor to the poor and deference to the rich, and it talks about judgment, the actual use of Rechilut is probably more legal. It has to do with giving evidence when you have to say something bad about somebody and where that's not necessary. Where a judge who leaves the court doesn't necessarily have to say, well, it's not that all of us agreed that he was blameless. But nonetheless, there's this commandment, quote unquote commandment, that has definitely taken root within Judaism in a very impactful way, even though it's truly not one of the 613 commandments. And what does that say about sometimes you need to be commanded and sometimes maybe you should figure it out on your own?
Yeah, I mean, that's also interesting. That, right, sometimes it's better not to be commanded, right?
Yeah, we've definitely come across that, even with the two sons of Aaron who were killed in service, so to speak. So there is that tension there. But this certainly became very mainstream. The interesting thing about the word rachil and rechilut that is different slightly from Lashon Hara is Rashi in the verse in Numbers that I just quoted. He goes on to talk about why does it say holech, Holech Rachil, and he starts making comparisons between sellers of merchandise and tale bearers. And so now he's talking about those people who almost make a living out of exposing other people's private lives. And that's certainly something that rings true to us today, where, if you say something bad, it's going to get a lot more hits than if you say something that's nice. This whole, whether it's the National Enquirer, this whole element of character assassination that seems to be so part and parcel of our politics. It's the more you think about it, this is a profound aspect of social life, and it ultimately is a blemish in terms of social mores. It's at the basis of so many bad things that affect us.
That is absolutely correct. I mean, it's interesting how we started with sarat, with leprosy, and we kind of are able to connect it all the way through to all these fascinating ideas.
Well, and I think in a sense, that's why leprosy is not a bad translation. Not because medically it's correct, but because, as you mentioned, right. Yes, this thing of calling out leper, maybe it was considered contagious. And that is clearly something that speaking bad or even nurturing a society that lives off the secrets of others, that lives off talking about others, is something that is clearly contagious. You get into, I think I came across an article from Rabbi Sachs of a teenager who committed suicide because of what people were saying about her. We live in a hyper situation with regard to these visceral attacks and visceral impact of words.
Yeah, I mean, obviously that's true. I mean, the internet makes these things so much more complicated, doesn't it?
It certainly does.
Because all of these things we're talking about, the feather pillow, the idea of rachil, the word rechilut comes from the word rachil. The word rachil means a merchant. And the way they explain it is that a merchant goes from place to place. And that's what our Lashon Hara does. It goes from place to place. The same idea. Is it not a powerful image? That actually comes from Rashi.
It actually does. And the other thing that Rashi says is he quotes a French word which comes from spy, espérer or something. The idea is not simply to come across this foul secret, but to look for it, to make an industry of it. So I should mention, and let's get back a second to the episode of Miriam and Aaron. So the commentaries have, try to figure out what was the content of Miriam's Lashon Hara. So if you recall when I quoted it, there are two things that come to mind. One is she said Moses' wife was a Cushite. And I thought for sure that, and a Cushite means an African, a black person. And I was sure that I would find in the commentaries a level of bias, of bigotry. I was sure that I would find something that harkened back to us discussion with the Reverend Washington way back when of the sin of Ham. And the reason I was so sure about it is because I remember as clear as day having an argument with my study partner at the yeshiva where he was talking about, listen, black people, it's no compliment. Look what happened with Miriam. And to my grand satisfaction, and maybe it's because I didn't have enough time, I did not find one classical commentary that read into this a racist remark. What they all focus on is that she was distinctive like a Cushite, because actually in the Bible it says that she was a Midianite, that he married a girl from Midian. So they explained that she stuck out in the crowd. Her beauty was so striking. It was like a dark-skinned person amongst white-skinned people. But one of the things that Reverend Washington told us, and I think some of us learn, is that skin color as a derogatory characteristic is a fairly new phenomenon. But again, I was pleasantly surprised on the one hand, but I think I cannot say conclusively, but anecdotally, I do find in certain circles of Jews that there is a high level of bigotry and bias. The word schwarze is used in a negative way. And I know that Lashon Hara and the laws that we're talking about today are studied in detail, but I think this core essential aspect of it seems to have lost their attention. Whether it's even Jews of color, Sephardim, and some members of Haredi society. And again, we all have it. We all have this, but I would like to think one of my takeaways from today's discussion is that on the one hand, talking in a bigoted fashion, whether you believe in bigotry or you're just using the words of the past, is Lashon Hara, and it needs to be enforced, and that the types of conversations that we have where the youth is getting too hypersensitive, and you can't get hypersensitive about Lashon Hara. If the Chafetz Chaim taught us anything, he wrote a book on every aspect of it, and he said the power of words is profound.
There is no question that that's right. I mean, and obviously that's right in terms of bigotry, and it's terrible that we live in a world where there is so much bigotry. And it is interesting, it's interesting that we're going to get there when we get to the book of Bamidbar. But what's fascinating is the Torah kind of goes out of its way to not be bigoted there. It'd be easy to be bigoted there, right? It'd be easy to say that what they were worrying about was the fact that he married a woman of color. But they go out of their way to say, no, that's not what we're talking about. It's almost as if they're sensitive to that very point.
I couldn't agree more. The other commentary as to what Miriam was saying that was negative was that she said she overheard a conversation of two people who had become prophets and had separated from their wives, and overheard Moses' wife say, yeah, I know what that's about. So they were getting into the marital affairs of Moses. And I think that too, the aspect of Lashon Hara that many times we can ignore is sexual innuendo. And this is the kind of core case history. Everything else becomes commentary. So I think that's another takeaway. We're running out of time. I would like to focus a little bit on the first instance of leprosy in the Bible, and that goes back, believe it or not, to the burning bush. In Exodus 4, if you recall, Moses is struck by the fact that the bush is burning and not consumed, and he says, what happens if the people of Israel don't listen to me? So the first thing that God says is grab the staff and throw it down. But then Moses goes further and he says that they may believe me that Hashem, the God of their ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob did appear to you. Hashem said to him further, put your hand in your bosom. He put his hand into his bosom, and when he took it out, his hand was encrusted with snowy scales. And God said, put your hand back into your bosom. And he put his hand back into his bosom, and when he took it out, this was like the rest of his body. So this is the first instance of leprosy that is related to something that Moses said. The traditional commentaries say he doubted the people of Israel. He said to God, they're not going to believe that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is there for them. And for that sin, he was punished. And isn't it interesting that we have Moses, Aaron, and Miriam, three siblings who all are kind of case studies in Tzuras?
So let me tell you what's fascinating to me about that story. It's amazing that Moshe gets leprosy for speaking Lashon Hara before the Torah tells us that you get leprosy for speaking Lashon Hara. The Torah hasn't gotten there yet, but Moses gets it anyway. It seems to me from that story that this was a common belief in the ancient world, that the punishment for Lashon Hara was leprosy. In Jewish, in Egyptian culture, in all cultures, everybody knew if you get leprosy, I know what I did wrong. It's like if you wake up tomorrow and you have COVID, God forbid, so you know you were exposed to somebody with COVID. If you wake up tomorrow with a white skin disease, you know you spoke Lashon Hara. And that's what happened to Moshe. The Torah doesn't need to tell us that that's what happened. That's an automatic. That's why you get leprosy. Isn't that interesting?
It is interesting. It's also interesting that from this perspective, Lashon Hara is when you speak badly of a people. So in a sense, when Israel is the only nation in the United Nations that gets blamed for crimes that it does possibly do or where it falls short, but it's one amongst the family of nations, that's Lashon Hara also. And for those of us who can talk about a whole people in one stroke and say that they are thus and they are the other, that also is Lashon Hara. So it seems to me that the more you journey through our texts, you see the profound effect that words can have to both heal but also to hurt. And I think at the end of the day, this brings it back to the Egypt story. This brings it back to a story of believing in our people, ultimately believing in ourselves. It comes down to national pride, and it comes down to giving that same pride to other peoples and to other nationalities, and that the Exodus story, therefore, is so universal.
And you know what? It goes to show that the most irrelevant of parshas is also the most relevant of parshas. I want to wish you Shabbat Shalom. And the next 2 weeks, there is no parsha because the next 2 weeks is Pesach. So therefore, we look forward to seeing everybody 3 weeks from now when we continue with another great parsha, the Parsha of Achremot. Chag Sameach, everybody. Enjoy and look forward to seeing you in a few weeks. Chag Sameach, Jeff.
Chag Sameach, Shabbat Shalom, and I love it. Madlik spring break. See you all in 3 weeks.